The mysterious arrival. The sun was setting on the small colony of New Horizons, a peaceful human settlement on the edge of known space. The sky, usually painted with soft shades of orange and purple, now seemed darker, as if something was about to happen. People went about their daily routines, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. John Carter, a mechanic by trade, wiped his hands on his coveralls and walked out of the repair shop. He had been working on an old, rusty generator all day and was eager to grab a bite to eat before calling it a night. His mind, however, was still on the job. He had a feeling that something was off in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He wasn't sure what it was, but the sensation gnawed at him. As he strolled down the dusty road of the colony, he looked up to see a strange, dark shape moving across the sky. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a starship either. The shape was massive, its outline barely visible against the dimming sky. It wasn't a familiar sight to John or anyone else in the colony. Something about the way it moved seemed unnatural, deliberate, yet unpredictable. He stopped walking, his curiosity piqued. The colony's automated security systems hadn't picked up anything unusual, but John's instincts told him this wasn't just another passing ship. There was something wrong with this one. It wasn't a friendly ship, and it was heading straight for New Horizons. Without hesitation, John reached into his pocket and pulled out his communicator. He tried to contact the colony's command center, but the signal was weak, garbled. His heart began to race as he realized the communication systems were being jammed. This wasn't just a random malfunction. Someone, or something, was blocking the signal. John's hand tightened around the communicator. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. There was something dangerous about this arrival, but who could it be? And why now? A sudden loud roar broke through the silence of the evening. It was the sound of engines, powerful and aggressive, roaring to life. John turned quickly, his heart pounding. The strange ship that had caught his attention earlier was descending rapidly toward the colony. Its enormous shape grew larger as it entered the atmosphere, its engines blazing bright against the darkening sky. The people of New Horizons were still oblivious, going about their business in the streets, not yet aware of the threat that was descending upon them. But John could see it all too clearly. The ship wasn't just here for a visit. It was here for something far worse. Within moments, the ship landed with a resounding thud, sending shockwaves through the ground. People finally began to notice. They looked up, their faces filled with confusion and fear as they saw the massive ship on the horizon. A loud metallic screech echoed from the ship as its landing ramp slowly descended. A deep mechanical voice boomed from the speakers on the ship, speaking in a language none of the humans could understand. John didn't need to understand the words. The tone was enough. It was cold. It was threatening. This was no diplomatic visit. This was an invasion. As the first figures began to emerge from the ship, John's heart skipped a beat. The beings that stepped out were unlike anything he had seen before. Their sleek armor glinted in the dim light of the setting sun, and their tall, imposing figures towered over the humans. They had a frightening aura about them, a silent menace that made John's blood run cold. The soldiers, with their sharp, angular features, moved with precision, scanning the area as if they were on a mission. The leader, a tall being with silver markings on his armor, stepped forward and raised his hand. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, swept over the colony with an air of superiority. John's mind raced. These weren't ordinary aliens. These were elite warriors, and they weren't here for peace. They were here to conquer. The humans of New Horizons were nothing more than obstacles to these invaders, and John had a sinking feeling that they were about to learn just how dangerous humans could be when they were backed into a corner. Suddenly, a loud voice echoed across the colony, its words sharp and commanding. "We are the Black Star Legion. Surrender now, and you will be spared." John's blood ran cold. The Black Star Legion. He had heard whispers about them, a ruthless, elite group of soldiers who had conquered countless worlds in the galaxy. They were known for their unrelenting aggression and overwhelming power. They didn't negotiate. They didn't show mercy. And now, they had come for new horizons. The people of the colony began to panic. Screams filled the air as families ran for cover, desperate to escape the approaching threat. John's heart raced as he looked around. He had to act fast. The colony's defense systems were woefully outdated, and they had no hope against the might of the Black Star Legion. But there was one thing John had that they didn't: the heart and mind of a human mechanic. He wasn't a soldier, but he had a unique set of skills. He knew how to fix things, break things, and use what he had around him to survive. And right now, he would need every ounce of his skills to protect the colony. With determination burning in his chest, John turned and ran toward the old mechanic's shop. The time for running was over. If the Empire thought they could take over this colony with ease, they were in for a very rude awakening. As he reached the door, John glanced back at the alien invaders, their cold eyes watching him. He knew one thing for sure: this would not be the last time they would encounter each other. And when the time came, they would learn exactly why humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The unlikely hero. John stood in the doorway of the mechanic's shop, his mind racing. The Black Star Legion had landed, and they had brought with them the weight of a terrifying reputation. He wasn't prepared for this. His hands trembled as he looked around the familiar shop, filled with tools and machines he'd spent years fixing and maintaining. This was his world, a world of gears, motors, and rusted metal, but it was no match for the sleek, powerful weapons of the invaders. But then a thought struck him. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be. He wasn't a soldier, but he could improvise. He could fix things, make things, and in this moment, maybe that was the one thing that could give humanity a fighting chance. John snapped out of his thoughts and grabbed a toolbox from the counter. He threw open the nearest storage locker and began pulling out parts. His mind worked at lightning speed as he assessed what he could use to mount a defense. There were always spare parts, old weapons, and some leftover tech from previous shipments. What could he build? A loud metallic clang echoed from outside, snapping him back to reality. The invaders were moving through the colony now, their armored feet thudding against the ground like a marching army. The colony's weak defenses were already crumbling under the weight of their advanced technology. John could hear distant explosions and screams as the invaders began rounding up the terrified civilians. There was no time to waste. He grabbed a few heavy-duty energy coils and large pieces of metal plating. He might not have military-grade weapons, but he knew how to make things work. One by one, he put together crude but effective devices, booby traps, makeshift guns, anything that could give him even the slightest edge against the enemy. As he worked, his thoughts kept returning to the same question: how had this happened so fast? Just hours ago, the colony had been peaceful, people living their lives, thinking they were safe in their corner of the galaxy. But now, their fate was in his hands. Suddenly, the door to the shop flew open. A group of civilians, bruised and terrified, rushed inside, seeking shelter. One woman, holding a child tightly in her arms, stumbled toward him. "Please, you have to help us," she gasped. "They're everywhere. They've already taken half the colony." Her eyes were wide with fear, and her voice trembled. John stood up, his heart pounding. He couldn't let them down. He wasn't a soldier, but he couldn't just hide while the colony was falling apart. The time for waiting was over. "Don't worry," John said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've got a plan." The woman's eyes widened. "A plan? What can we possibly do?" "They have the entire colony surrounded." John didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked over to the makeshift weapons and tech he had assembled. He held up a crude energy blaster, its parts hastily pieced together. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. For a while. "I'm going to buy us some time," he said. Outside, the chaos continued. The Black Star Legion was methodical, searching for resistance wherever they could find it. Their leader, a towering figure in dark armor, seemed to be overseeing the destruction, his cold eyes scanning the scene for any sign of defiance. John could sense the alien warriors were overconfident, thinking their victory was certain. They don't know what humans are capable of when pushed to the edge, he thought bitterly. But the odds were against him. The weapons he had fashioned weren't nearly enough to take down an army, especially one that had conquered countless worlds. Still, there was something about him, something fierce, something that had been dormant for years, that sparked to life when he saw the civilians in danger. He motioned for the group to follow him. "Get to the maintenance tunnels," John said, leading the way. "It's our best chance." As they hurried through the darkened colony streets, John's mind worked furiously. He had to think fast. The tunnels were used for maintenance and storage, a labyrinth beneath the colony that no one except the most experienced workers knew how to navigate. It was dangerous and cramped, but it was also their only escape. Just as they neared the entrance, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. John spun around, heart racing, as a group of Black Star Legion soldiers rounded the corner. They weren't far behind. The invaders had spotted them. Without thinking, John reached for his blaster and fired. The shot was imperfect, but it struck one of the soldiers in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The others hesitated, surprised by the unexpected resistance. "Go," John shouted to the civilians. "Now." The woman with the child grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the tunnel. But John didn't follow them immediately. He was the last line of defense. The Black Star Legion soldiers regrouped, their weapons raised, ready to fire. John's heart pounded as he aimed his blaster again. He was just one man, but he wasn't going to let them take his home without a fight. A loud, explosive sound ripped through the air as one of the makeshift traps he'd set went off, catching a group of soldiers off guard. The explosion was enough to send them scattering, giving John the moment he needed. He sprinted toward the entrance to the tunnels, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The woman and child were already inside, and John was right behind them. They ducked into the darkness of the tunnels just as more soldiers came running toward them. The entrance to the tunnel closed with a loud clang behind them, muffling the sound of the chaos above. For now, they were safe. But John knew this was only the beginning. The Black Star Legion wouldn't stop until they had claimed everything. As they made their way deeper into the tunnels, John couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had no idea how they were going to win this fight, but he was damn sure that he wasn't going to let these invaders take New Horizons without a hell of a fight. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who was about to show them just how dangerous humans could be. The hidden power of the Dithworlders. As John led the civilians deeper into the maintenance tunnels, the air grew thicker with tension. The faint hum of the colony systems buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of how precariously their world hung in the balance. The tunnels, dark and narrow, twisted and turned in every direction, leading them into the heart of the colony's underbelly. There was no guarantee of safety here, but it was their only chance to regroup and plan their next move. John's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his makeshift weapon, the weight of what they were up against settling over him like a storm cloud. The Black Star Legion, powerful, ruthless, and unyielding, was used to crushing resistance. They'd invaded countless worlds and destroyed civilizations. What chance did they have? But there was one thing John had learned from years of fixing ships, engines, and machines. Humans had a tendency to surprise their enemies. The Black Star Legion underestimated them, and that, John realized, might just be their greatest mistake. As they moved through the tunnels, John's thoughts raced. The makeshift traps he had set earlier weren't going to be enough to stop an entire invading force. He needed a real plan, and he needed it fast. "We can't stay down here forever," one of the civilians whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll find us eventually. They have scanners and technology that we can't even begin to understand." John's eyes narrowed. She was right. Those soldiers were relentless. But he also knew one thing they didn't. Humanity, despite being seen as primitive by the rest of the galaxy, had something more dangerous than any weapon or technology. They had the heart and tenacity to fight back when pushed to the edge. They didn't give up, and that was what set them apart from the countless other species who had fallen to the Legion. "We don't need to run," John said, his voice low but steady. "We need to make them think we're not worth the effort. And then we hit them where it hurts." A couple of the civilians gave him puzzled looks. A plan to strike back seemed impossible, but John wasn't about to back down now. He had been a mechanic all his life, fixing engines and ships. But today, he had to do more. Much more. John motioned for them to follow him. They navigated deeper into the tunnels, passing rusted pipes and old storage rooms. There, in the far corner of the underground network, was what he was looking for. A hidden armory, left over from the colony's military days. The doors were sealed shut, but John quickly got to work, his fingers flying over the controls. Inside the armory, dusty crates full of old weapons and supplies lay untouched. They hadn't been used in years, but in this moment, they were exactly what John needed. He opened one crate and pulled out a rifle, old but still functional. He inspected it for a moment before moving on to the next crate. His mind worked fast, considering what weapons would give them the best shot at survival. Heavy grenades, energy shields, combat suits. Their chances of surviving were slim, but with the right tools, they might just have a chance. "We're going to need to fortify this place," John said, tossing the civilians a few weapons. He wasn't sure how long they would be able to hold out, but he knew the Legion wouldn't stop searching for them. They had to be prepared for whatever came next. Just then, a loud noise echoed through the tunnels. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. The unmistakable sound of armored boots. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The Black Star Legion had found them. There was no time to waste. He quickly rallied the group, pointing them to defensive positions as he readied his blaster. He could hear the soldiers coming closer, their voices muffled by the walls, but growing louder with every second. It was clear they were searching for anyone left alive, and John knew they wouldn't stop until they found every last civilian. "We need to buy some time," John muttered to himself. He thought back to the weapons they had found in the armory, the old grenades. He wasn't sure how effective they would be against the Legion's advanced armor, but they had to do something. He handed one of the grenades to the woman who had led them into the tunnels. "When I give the signal, you pull the pin and throw it. Don't hesitate." The woman nodded, her face pale but determined. John could see the fear in her eyes, but also a spark of hope. She wasn't ready to give up. No one here was ready to give up. They were alive, and they were going to stay that way. John crouched down, peering around the corner of the tunnel. He could see the shadows of the invaders moving closer. He took a deep breath and steadied his weapon. The soldiers were close, too close. He glanced at the group behind him. "Get ready," he said. "When the first one rounds the corner, we hit them hard. We take them by surprise. We show them why they shouldn't have messed with humanity." Just as he was about to signal the attack, the first invader appeared around the corner, a massive soldier, clad in dark, shiny armor. His helmet reflected the dim light of the tunnel, and he scanned the area, clearly alert and cautious. He was about to step forward when John took the shot. The blaster crackled with energy as it hit the soldier's chest. The invader staggered back, stunned for a moment, before retaliating. But it was too late. The grenade went off, sending a powerful blast echoing through the tunnels. The soldier's armor absorbed most of the impact, but the explosion sent him reeling. The others reacted quickly, but they weren't expecting a full-on counterattack. John and the civilians opened fire, each taking aim at the invaders. John's heart raced as he moved quickly, trying to avoid the alien fire while targeting weak points in their armor. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, John knew one thing for sure. The Black Star Legion had underestimated humanity. And that mistake was apt. The battle for survival. The echoes of the explosion reverberated through the tunnels, but the battle was far from over. As John ducked behind a rusted column, his heart hammered in his chest. The blast had caught the Legion soldier off guard, but it wasn't enough to take him down. The invader's armor, designed to withstand extreme conditions, had absorbed most of the blast. John could hear the soldiers' comms chatter, calling for reinforcements. They were getting organized, and that meant time was running out. "We need to move," John said, his voice low but urgent. The civilians behind him scrambled to take cover, clutching the old weapons he had handed them. Fear was written on their faces, but there was also determination. They weren't just going to roll over and die. Not today. John's mind raced as he assessed their options. The tunnels were a maze, offering both opportunities and dangers. The walls were lined with old maintenance conduits and unused passages that could lead to more weapons, or they could be traps. There was no way to know for sure, but one thing was certain. If they stayed where they were dead. "Everyone, stay close," John ordered, his voice sharp. "We're not going to win this by hiding. We need to hit them before they regroup." He moved quickly, leading the group through the tunnels. The soldier's footsteps were getting closer, his heavy boots thudding against the metal floor. John peered around a corner and saw 2 more Legion soldiers advancing, their armored forms towering over the civilians. They were too well-equipped, too disciplined. John knew that if they got close enough, they'd wipe them out with ease. But there was something the Legion didn't know. Humanity was a creature of chaos. They didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't follow predictable patterns. And they didn't give up. John's eyes narrowed. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small device, a detonator. It was a simple tool, but in the right hands, it could be the key to taking out the Legion soldiers. He turned to the woman who had helped him earlier. "I need you to take this," he said, handing her the detonator. "When I say so, push the button. Make sure you're far enough back that the blast doesn't hit you." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Got it." John's mind clicked into gear. He needed to buy them some time, create a diversion that would allow them to get closer. He glanced at the old pipes running along the walls of the tunnel, leading to a large storage chamber ahead. The pipes were thick, reinforced, and connected to the colony's old fuel system. With a grim smile, he moved toward the pipes. He knew exactly what he had to do. There were a few things a mechanic learned from years of fixing engines, how to turn ordinary tools into deadly weapons. He pulled out a wrench from his belt and began to work quickly, using the wrench to loosen a valve that controlled the flow of gas into the system. The pipes hissed and groaned, and a faint but unmistakable smell filled the air. Fuel. He was setting a trap. A big one. "Everyone, get back," John warned, his voice steady despite the tension rising in his chest. The civilians didn't hesitate. They knew John wasn't a man to second-guess. Just as he finished the final adjustment, the first of the Legion soldiers rounded the corner. John glanced over his shoulder, locking eyes with the woman holding the detonator. He gave her a quick nod, signaling her to be ready. The Legion soldier saw John, his face visible through the tinted visor of his helmet. "There you are," the soldier sneered, raising his weapon. Before the soldier could fire, John's hand shot out, slamming the detonator button. The explosion was deafening. The blast ripped through the tunnel, sending shockwaves down the walls. The pipes exploded with a violent roar, flames and debris scattering in every direction. The Legion soldiers were caught off guard, their armor barely able to protect them from the sheer force of the explosion. The tunnel was plunged into chaos, smoke and fire filling the air. John and the civilians ducked behind cover, the heat of the blast searing the air around them. The tremors of the explosion rattled the walls, and for a moment, it felt like the entire colony was shaking. When the smoke finally began to clear, John peered around the corner. The Legion soldiers were down, 2 of them incapacitated, the third buried beneath a pile of rubble. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was a huge step forward. They had just eliminated a significant threat, and for the first time since the invasion began, John allowed himself a brief moment of hope. But there was no time to celebrate. The rest of the Legion soldiers would be closing in soon, and they would not be so easily fooled again. "Let's move," John said, his voice grim but determined. He gestured for the group to follow him. "We need to get to the central control room. If we can disable the Legion's communication systems, we can buy ourselves more time." The civilians, now emboldened by the small victory, nodded. They were still scared, but there was something else in their eyes now. Resilience. They were beginning to understand that humans weren't just surviving on this death world. They were fighting back. John led them deeper into the colony, each step a reminder that they were taking this war to the heart of the Legion's operation. They weren't going to back down. They weren't going to hide. They were going to keep fighting, keep pushing forward, until the Legion understood the one simple truth that made humanity so dangerous. Humanity was not the prey. They were the predators, the heart of the storm. John led the group down a narrow maintenance corridor, the flickering lights above them, casting long, eerie shadows. Their victory over the Legion soldiers in the tunnels had been brief, but it had given them a glimmer of hope. The civilians were more determined now, moving with purpose and fewer signs of fear. John, however, was acutely aware that the real battle had yet to begin. They had taken out one group of soldiers, but the Legion would send more. They always sent more. As they moved deeper into the colony, John's mind raced with plans and possibilities. The central control room was their next target, a critical point for the Legion's operations. If they could take it, they might be able to cripple the enemy's communications and sabotage their systems. But getting there would be dangerous. The further they went, the more likely it was that the Legion had reinforcements already on the way. "We're almost there," John muttered, checking his weapon. A crude yet effective plasma rifle he cobbled together with parts from various machines. He had no formal training in combat, but years of tinkering with engines had made him resourceful. And right now, that was what counted. He looked back at the civilians. They were tired, but they had come a long way. They were no longer the scared group that had stumbled into this fight. They had proven their mettle. A few of them had picked up weapons along the way, some of them even showing a surprising aptitude for them. But John knew that against the Legion, sheer will and grit wouldn't be enough. They had to keep moving, fast and quiet. As they reached the next intersection, John signaled for everyone to stop. His heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the area. The hallway ahead was clear, but there was something off. He could feel it in the air, a shift in the atmosphere. It was too quiet. His instincts kicked in. He moved quickly, pulling the group back around the corner, just as a squad of Legion soldiers rounded the other end of the corridor. They were heavily armed, their footfalls heavy as they marched down the hall, completely unaware of the group hiding just a few feet away. John held his breath, motioning for everyone to stay still. The civilians crouched low, their eyes wide with fear, but they followed his lead. He knew if even one of them panicked, the entire group would be exposed. His hands gripped the wrench in his belt, his mind racing for a solution. They couldn't stay here forever, but charging in blindly would be suicide. The Legion soldiers passed by, their weapons at the ready. John watched them go, the tension building in his chest. They had to move now. He counted to 3 in his head, then motioned for the group to follow him, slipping out from behind the corner as the last soldier disappeared from sight. They moved quickly but cautiously, keeping their steps light and their bodies pressed against the walls. John led the way, eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. The central control room was just a few doors away. If they could get there, they might be able to turn the tide of the war. But with every step, he could feel the weight of the risk. They reached the door to the control room. It was a large, reinforced entryway with a biometric lock. There was no time for subtlety. John took a deep breath and slammed his wrench into the side of the door, using all his strength to break open the small access panel. "Cover me," he whispered to the woman with the detonator. She nodded, raising her weapon, eyes trained on the hallway. The others took cover as well, watching for any signs of movement. John worked fast. He knew that if they were going to make it, they had to get through the door now. His fingers flew over the controls as he hacked into the system. The door was resistant, but not enough to keep him out. With a final flick of his wrist, the door buzzed and slid open with a mechanical whine. The central control room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the hum of machinery. Inside, rows of computers blinked with activity, their screens displaying real-time data from across the colony. John's eyes darted around the room, searching for the central control panel. He found it at the far end of the room, guarded by a single soldier who was seated at the terminal, unaware of their presence. "Quiet," John whispered, motioning for the group to stay still. John knew they had to take out the soldier before he could alert the rest of the Legion. The moment the soldier noticed them, the entire room would be flooded with reinforcements. They had only one chance. He signaled to the woman with the detonator, "On my mark." She nodded, gripping the detonator tightly. The others adjusted their stances, weapons ready. John took a deep breath. Then, without warning, he moved. He sprinted forward, his feet pounding the floor, and threw himself at the soldier, knocking him out of his chair with a grunt. The soldier barely had time to react before John pressed his wrench to the man's throat. "Don't make a sound," John growled, pinning the soldier against the wall. The soldier's eyes widened in shock, his hands raised in surrender. The control room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. John turned to the woman. "Now." With a quick motion, she pressed the button. The soldier's eyes widened as the explosion rocked the control room, disabling the central communication systems and setting off a chain reaction that took out several key systems. John didn't wait to see the result. He grabbed the soldier's weapon and tossed it to one of the civilians. "Move," he barked. The group scattered, making their way to the control panel. With the systems down, their next move was clear: escape. They had won a small victory, but they had to stay ahead of the Legion if they were going to survive. They weren't done yet. The Legion would send more soldiers, but for now, the Dithworlders had the advantage. The rising tide. The escape from the control room was nothing short of a miracle. As the team retreated through the corridors, John could hear the shrill blare of alarms echoing in the distance, signaling that the Legion had been alerted to the breach. His heart pounded in his chest as he led the civilians through the maze of tunnels, keeping them as quiet as possible. The once muted sounds of their footsteps now felt deafening, each one threatening to expose them. John had no illusions about their situation. They had made an impact by taking down the central control room, but it had come with a cost. The Legion wouldn't just let them escape. They would send everything they had to stop them. Every second they wasted, they risked being surrounded. "We need to get to the escape pods," John muttered to himself, trying to focus on the mission. "That's our only way out." But as they moved deeper into the facility, it became clear that the escape routes were more complex than he had anticipated. The passageways weren't designed for civilian evacuation. They were intended for military maneuvering, and with every turn they made, it seemed like the corridors only stretched further and further, as though the whole station was designed to confuse and entrap them. The civilians, though exhausted and frightened, followed John's lead without question. There was a silent agreement between them all. They had come this far, and they wouldn't let fear stop them now. Some of them even started to adjust to their weapons, moving with more confidence. John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were no longer the frightened civilians who had stumbled into this fight. They were warriors in their own right, fighting for their survival. But the deeper they went, the heavier the air became. John could feel the temperature rising, and there was an almost electric hum in the air. The station was alive with activity. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows. It felt like they were walking through a beast's stomach, suffocating, suffused with a sense of impending doom. "Are we getting closer?" one of the civilians asked, his voice tight with fear. John didn't have an answer. He had no idea where the escape pods were. They had to keep moving, though. They couldn't afford to stand still and think too much. But then, just as they reached another intersection, they froze. A massive explosion shook the entire station, rattling the walls and sending a shudder through the floor. The force of it knocked several people off their feet, and the roar of the blast was deafening. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, everything went dark. John was the first to recover, shaking off the disorientation as he stood up. His heart raced in his chest. He could hear shouting, gunfire, and the clatter of metal on metal. The explosion hadn't just been a random accident. It had been an attack. "Get down," John shouted, pushing the nearest civilian into a nearby alcove as more explosions rocked the facility. The once sterile, quiet space was now filled with chaos. He peeked around the corner and saw the Legion soldiers flooding into the hallway. They were wearing full battle gear, their weapons raised and scanning the area. Their faces were obscured by helmets, but their movements were precise, practiced. They were here, and they weren't going to stop until they hunted down every last one of the civilians. John's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. If they didn't act fast, they would be cornered. "Everyone, follow me," he ordered. "We need to find a way to outsmart them. We can't take them head on, but we can use the station against them." Without waiting for confirmation, he motioned for them to follow and led them down another hallway, hoping they could find a way to turn the tables on the Legion. They moved quickly, but the sounds of the enemy soldiers grew louder with each passing second. They were getting closer. John didn't know how much longer they could keep running. It was then that he saw it, a maintenance hatch that led into the station's lower levels. It was small and unassuming, hidden behind a stack of crates, but it could be their ticket out. John had no idea where the hatch led, but it was better than facing the Legion head-on. "Over there," John pointed, and the group sprinted toward the hatch. They had no time to waste. He grabbed the handle and wrenched it open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel beneath them. One by one, the civilians scrambled into the tunnel, their faces pale with fear but determined. John was the last to go in, keeping a vigilant eye on the entrance. He slammed the hatch shut just as the first of the Legion soldiers turned the corner, their heavy boots clanging against the metal floor. The tunnel was dank and dark, the walls lined with old wiring and pipes. It was cramped, uncomfortable, but it was safe for now. John led the group through the winding passage, moving as quickly as he could without risking injury. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the tight space, but at least they weren't being pursued directly. The hatch had bought them a few precious minutes. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached another access door. This one led to an old maintenance bay, abandoned, but possibly still functional. John hesitated for a moment, listening carefully. There were no sounds from above, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the Legion was closing in. "Stay here," John whispered. "I'll check it out." He opened the door just enough to slip through, peering out into the bay. The space was vast, filled with rows of old, unused equipment. There was a sense of eerie silence in the air, the kind that only came when danger was near. John crept forward, his senses on high alert. And then he saw it. Sitting in the far corner of the bay, untouched by the chaos, was an escape pod. John's breath caught in his throat. It was their way out. But there was one problem. It was locked down, secured by a keypad and biometric lock. The group had made it this far. Now, they just needed to make sure they could escape alive. The final stand. The escape pod was within reach. John could almost feel the cold metal of its hatch, the promise of freedom just beyond the wall of obstacles. But as he stared at the locked security mechanism, the pressure mounting with every second, he couldn't help but wonder if they'd make it. The alarms were blaring now, and the Legion soldiers were undoubtedly closing in, their footsteps echoing from every direction. Time was running out. He crouched beside the locked panel, working quickly. The keypad was a relic, a mix of old and new technology, a combination of code, fingerprints, and retinal scans, designed to keep everyone out except those with proper clearance. John had no clearance, no passwords, no biometric data, but he had something better: experience. "Come on," he muttered to himself, working his fingers over the control panel. His tools, a basic multi-tool he carried on him at all times, moved swiftly over the panel, trying to bypass the security. Sweat dripped down his forehead as the sounds of the Legion soldiers grew louder, closer, too close. "John, we're running out of time," one of the civilians whispered urgently, peering nervously over the edge of the bay entrance. "They're almost here." He didn't need to hear the warning. He could feel the tension rising in the air, the inevitable conclusion of their frantic race against time. But John refused to panic. If there was one thing he'd learned in his years as a mechanic, it was that when things seemed impossible, you had to stay calm. You had to think like a machine. Logical, precise, unyielding. His hand shook slightly, but his movements remained steady as he continued to work on the lock. He could hear the faint hum of the escape pod systems, the low whir of its engines, as if it was urging him to finish. But it was the sound of boots, heavy boots, clanging down the hall that really made his heart race. The Legion was right outside. Then finally, there was a soft click. The lock disengaged. The hatch opened with a groan, the sound echoing through the bay, as if the ship itself was exhaling. John's heart leaped in his chest. He didn't waste any time looking back. "Get in," he shouted, his voice rough but firm. "Move, now." One by one, the civilians sprinted towards the pod, climbing in as quickly as they could. John didn't hesitate, not even for a moment. He followed them inside, slamming the hatch shut behind him. As he did, he saw the first few Legion soldiers enter the bay, their weapons raised, too late. The door sealed, and with it, their last hope of survival. John sprinted to the pilot's seat. The pod was an old model, nothing like the sleek, advanced ships the Legion used, but it was functional. He yanked on the emergency lever, starting the engines. The ship shuddered as the thrusters came to life, rumbling beneath him. "We're getting out of here," John muttered to himself, gripping the controls with a newfound strength. His mind was clear now. They were going to escape. The Legion may have had elite warriors, but they had underestimated humanity's resolve. The pod shot upward, breaking free from the hangar bay and into the vastness of space. The station behind them exploded in a fiery burst, the shockwave rippling through the void. John's stomach lurched as the force of the explosion rattled the ship, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't the time for fear. It was the time for action. "Are we clear?" one of the civilians asked, breathing heavily, their voice trembling. John glanced at the screen. They had cleared the station's perimeter, and they were on a trajectory toward the nearest safe zone, a small, uncharted moon where they could regroup and find refuge. "We're clear," John confirmed, his voice steady. "We made it." As the ship entered the empty silence of space, the tension in John's chest began to ease. The group was safe for now, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The Legion would not forget what had happened here. They would come for them. But for now, they had won. They had defied the odds, and they had escaped. And as the stars stretched out before them, John allowed himself one moment of relief. They were alive, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The escape pod soared into the unknown, leaving behind the wreckage of their battle, their enemies, and the chaos that had nearly consumed them. And as the stars glistened ahead, one thing was certain. Humanity had proven that it wasn't just a species of survivors. It was a species of fighters. And the galaxy was about to learn that lesson in full force.